Spring, 1945. The war in Europe has ended, but the silence feels unfamiliar. In a German city reduced to broken stone and twisted steel, children move carefully through streets that no longer resemble streets at all. Entire blocks are gone. Roofs lie open to the sky. Brick dust coats everything: shoes, hands, faces. The air still carries the faint smell of smoke and damp concrete. These children have learned to live among ruins. They play where houses once stood. They sleep in basements, cellars, or whatever walls remain upright. For months, they have been told to fear the enemy approaching from the west. American soldiers, the victors, were expected to punish, to occupy, to take. Instead, military trucks arrive carrying lumber, tools, and engineers. Not shells. Not orders barked in anger. Uniformed men begin clearing rubble. Temporary roofs are raised. Walls are reinforced. Windows are measured and replaced. Children watch from a distance, unsure whether this is temporary or real. For the first time since the bombings began, something is being built instead of destroyed. And as those shattered streets slowly change, the story of how victory transformed into responsibility is only beginning to unfold. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the physical destruction of the country was unlike anything Europe had experienced in modern history. Years of strategic bombing, followed by ground combat across cities and industrial regions, had left vast urban areas uninhabitable. The Allied air campaign, conducted primarily by the British Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces, had targeted transportation hubs, factories, oil facilities, and major population centers. What remained after those raids was not simply damaged infrastructure, but entire communities stripped of shelter. By conservative post-war estimates, more than 7.5 million German civilians were homeless by the summer of 1945. In cities such as Cologne, Hamburg, Essen, and Dresden, between 40 and 70% of housing stock had been destroyed or severely damaged. Streets were blocked by rubble several meters deep. Sewer systems had collapsed. Clean water was scarce. Electricity functioned sporadically, if at all. Children were the most visible presence in this landscape. Many fathers were dead, missing, or prisoners of war. Mothers struggled to secure food while attempting to keep families together amid constant displacement. Schools had been destroyed or repurposed as shelters and aid stations. Childhood, as it had existed before the war, had effectively ended. As Allied troops advanced into German territory in early 1945, military planners anticipated chaos. Civil unrest, starvation, disease, and mass migration were expected. Initial Allied policy reflected these fears. Germany was to be occupied, controlled, and prevented from ever waging war again. The country was divided into zones, each administered by a different Allied power. The United States assumed responsibility for large portions of southern and central Germany, including Bavaria, Hesse, and Württemberg-Baden. The first American units entering these areas were combat troops. Their mission was clear: secure territory, disarm remaining German forces, and establish order. But almost immediately, military commanders confronted a reality that had not been fully anticipated. Victory had left behind millions of civilians with no means to survive the coming months. Food shortages were severe. The winter of 1945-46 would later be remembered as one of the harshest of the century. Transportation networks were shattered, preventing the movement of coal and supplies. Farms had lost labor and livestock. Disease spread rapidly through overcrowded shelters. In this environment, children were especially vulnerable, lacking nutrition, warmth, and medical care. American military government officers quickly realized that occupation could not rely on force alone. A population pushed to desperation would threaten stability, security, and long-term peace. Reconstruction, even in its earliest forms, was not a gesture of kindness. It was a strategic necessity. Engineers from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers were reassigned from combat support to emergency civil works. Military administrators began surveying damage, prioritizing basic shelter repairs, and organizing civilian labor for rubble clearance. Temporary housing programs were established using salvaged materials. These efforts were limited, cautious, and tightly controlled, but they marked a shift in purpose. For German children watching these developments, the distinction between punishment and survival was not theoretical. It was visible in whether a roof could be patched before winter arrived. It was visible in whether a school reopened or remained a ruin. And it was visible in the unfamiliar sight of former enemies measuring walls instead of aiming rifles. As the occupation settled into its first uneasy months, American policy began to evolve under the pressure of reality, moving slowly from control toward stabilization and laying the groundwork for decisions that would shape Germany's future. That transformation did not happen all at once, and it did not happen without resistance, doubt, or fear on both sides. The transition from combat operations to occupation administration exposed deep uncertainty within the Allied command structure. In Washington, London, and Paris, policymakers debated how far responsibility toward the defeated population should extend. Germany was not merely a ruined battlefield. It was a society that had mobilized for total war and now lay physically and morally exhausted. The question facing the occupiers was not abstract. Could stability be achieved without rebuilding the very country they had just defeated? Initially, American occupation policy reflected restraint and suspicion. Early directives emphasized demilitarization, denazification, and economic controls designed to prevent renewed aggression. Industrial output was restricted. German administrative authority was tightly supervised. There was no grand reconstruction plan in 1945. What existed instead was emergency management, preventing famine, containing disease, and avoiding mass unrest. Within the U.S. zone, military government detachments were embedded at regional and local levels. These officers, often with backgrounds in engineering, law, or civil administration, were responsible for restoring basic functions: sanitation, housing allocation, food distribution, and public safety. Their authority extended into daily civilian life. For German families, especially children, these uniformed administrators became the first consistent face of post-war order. Housing quickly emerged as one of the most urgent challenges. Bombing had not only destroyed homes, it had fractured entire neighborhoods. Families were scattered. Refugees from the east, fleeing the advance of Soviet forces, poured into already devastated cities and villages. Overcrowding reached critical levels. Cellars designed for temporary shelter became permanent dwellings. In some urban districts, 10 or more people occupied single rooms meant for two. American officers confronted a dilemma. Large-scale reconstruction was politically sensitive and logistically impossible in the immediate aftermath. But without intervention, mortality rates among children and the elderly would continue to rise. The response was pragmatic. Rubble clearance programs were expanded. Usable materials were salvaged from destroyed buildings. Temporary repairs, roofs, doors, windows were prioritized over full reconstruction. Children were frequently present at these sites. With schools closed and parents occupied with survival, they wandered through reconstruction zones, watching soldiers and engineers work. These were not symbolic gestures. U.S. Army engineer units repaired bridges to allow food transport. They restored water pumping stations to prevent disease. They stabilized damaged residential blocks so families could return indoors before winter. At the same time, American forces enforced strict discipline among their own ranks. Fraternization policies were initially harsh, reflecting fears of undermining authority or legitimizing former enemies. Yet, on the ground, reality often softened rigid directives. Soldiers encountered civilians who were not soldiers, not party officials, but children scavenging for coal and wood. Reports from the period describe increasing concern among junior officers and medics over child malnutrition and exposure. The presence of children altered the psychological landscape of occupation. They were not symbols of ideology, but of consequence. Their condition reflected the immediate outcome of total war more clearly than any damaged factory or collapsed bridge. For many American personnel, Reconstruction ceased to be an abstract policy discussion and became a daily operational necessity. By late 1945, the tone of occupation had subtly shifted. While Germany remained under firm control, the emphasis increasingly moved toward stabilization rather than retribution. This shift did not erase the past, nor did it absolve responsibility. But it acknowledged a fundamental reality. Peace could not be enforced among ruins alone. For German children, this change was experienced not through speeches or proclamations, but through altered routines. Streets slowly cleared. Homes became habitable again. Schools, even in damaged buildings, reopened. Life remained difficult, but it no longer felt suspended between war and uncertainty. This evolving approach, shaped by necessity, observation, and human contact, set the stage for deeper questions about responsibility, power, and the long-term meaning of victory. Those questions would soon be examined from multiple angles, revealing how reconstruction was not only a logistical task, but a test of leadership, morality, and memory. The first and most immediate angle through which post-war reconstruction must be understood is the human one. In 1945, German children did not experience defeat as a political event. They experienced it as hunger, cold, and displacement. Their world had collapsed not in declarations or surrender ceremonies, but in the absence of routine. No school bells, no stable homes, no certainty that tomorrow would resemble yesterday. American occupation forces encountered this reality daily. Patrol reports, medical logs, and military government memoranda from the period repeatedly noted the presence of children in public spaces, unsupervised, undernourished, and exposed. These observations were not incidental. They informed how reconstruction priorities were set on the ground. Housing repair, sanitation, and food distribution were not separate issues. They were interconnected elements of child survival. From a moral angle, this placed American commanders in a difficult position. The occupying force represented a victorious nation that had suffered its own losses and destruction. Yet it now exercised power over a defeated population whose most visible victims were civilians who had no role in military decision-making. The presence of children complicated any notion of collective guilt. It forced a distinction between accountability and responsibility. Reconstruction efforts therefore took on an ethical dimension beyond policy. Clearing rubble was not simply about restoring urban function. It was about removing hazards where children played. Repairing roofs was not merely about property. It was about preventing illness and death during winter. These tasks were executed by soldiers trained for combat, now operating in environments where restraint, patience, and judgment mattered as much as discipline. A second angle emerges when examining the tactical realities of occupation. Stability was a military objective. Disorder, starvation, and disease posed risks not only to civilians but to occupying troops. Outbreaks of typhus and dysentery in overcrowded areas threatened to spread. Refugee movements strained supply lines. From this perspective, rebuilding homes and infrastructure was a preventative security measure. American engineers and military government officers approached reconstruction with limited resources and strict oversight. Materials were scarce. Civilian labor was organized under supervision. Priorities were determined block by block, often favoring structures that could be made habitable quickly rather than restored fully. This pragmatic approach reflected the constraints of occupation, not a lack of concern. The third angle is psychological. For German civilians, the arrival of American aid challenged deeply ingrained wartime narratives. Years of propaganda had portrayed the Allies as brutal destroyers. Children, in particular, had been raised with these images. When the same soldiers who had advanced through their towns began repairing homes and organizing shelters, the cognitive dissonance was immediate and profound. This did not produce instant trust. Fear remained. Uniforms still represented authority and potential punishment. But the repeated, observable actions of rebuilding created a slow shift in perception. Reconstruction was visible, could be watched, measured, and verified day by day. Walls rose, roofs closed, windows returned. For children, this visibility mattered. They were not participants in political reconciliation, but they were witnesses to physical change. Their belief in permanence, in the idea that homes could exist again, depended on what they saw with their own eyes. A fourth angle concerns leadership at the local level. While policy was set by higher command, its execution depended on junior officers, engineers, and administrators operating in towns and villages. These individuals made daily decisions that shaped civilian experience. How strictly to enforce regulations, how to allocate limited materials, how to respond to civilian need without undermining authority. Records from U.S. military government units indicate significant variation in approach. Some officers emphasized strict control, others prioritized cooperation. Where Reconstruction progressed most effectively, it was often where local leadership balanced firmness with adaptability, recognizing that long-term stability required more than compliance. Through these human, moral, tactical, and psychological lenses, Reconstruction emerges as a complex process shaped by necessity rather than sentiment. It was neither purely humanitarian nor purely strategic. It existed in the space between, and as these angles intersected, they pushed the occupation toward a decisive realization that rebuilding homes was inseparable from rebuilding trust. That realization would soon be tested by events that forced occupation policy beyond improvisation and into deliberate commitment. Another critical angle through which post-war rebuilding must be understood is the technological and logistical challenge faced by the occupying forces. Germany's destruction was not uniform. Some towns were nearly intact. Others were flattened beyond recognition. This uneven devastation complicated planning. Reconstruction could not follow a single model. It required rapid assessment, flexibility, and improvisation, all under the constraints of military occupation. American engineering units were central to this effort. Trained to build bridges under fire and restore supply routes during combat, they now applied those same skills to civilian environments. Their priorities reflected hard lessons learned during the war. Mobility, sanitation, and shelter were the foundations of any functioning society. Without passable roads, food could not move. Without clean water, disease spread. Without housing, civilians could not recover. Children remained a constant presence in these calculations. Temporary shelters were evaluated not just for capacity, but for safety. Heating systems were repaired to reduce winter mortality. In some districts, abandoned military barracks and undamaged public buildings were converted into family housing. These decisions, though administrative in nature, shaped childhood survival rates in the immediate post-war years. The leadership angle reveals how occupation policy evolved under pressure. Senior American commanders in Germany, including military governors and zone administrators, were tasked with enforcing Allied directives while responding to unfolding realities on the ground. Reports flowing upward from local units consistently emphasized housing shortages and child welfare concerns. These reports did not argue for sympathy. They argued for practicality. By late 1945, American leadership increasingly recognized that prolonged instability would undermine broader strategic goals in Europe. A devastated Germany would become a burden rather than a stabilizing force. While large-scale economic recovery plans were still months away, smaller decisions, authorizing additional repairs, reallocating engineering resources, permitting limited civilian autonomy, reflected a shift toward long-term thinking. The enemy perspective angle also plays a role in understanding this period. For German civilians, defeat was accompanied by uncertainty about their future place in Europe. Children absorbed this uncertainty without the context to interpret it. They had lived through air raids, evacuation, and propaganda. Now they faced occupation by foreign soldiers whose intentions were unclear. The sight of Americans rebuilding homes disrupted expectations. It challenged the assumption that defeat would bring only punishment. Yet skepticism remained. Reconstruction did not erase hunger. It did not restore lost family members. It did, however, introduce the possibility of continuity, that life could resume in some form. There is also a moral leadership angle that emerges when examining how American forces chose to allocate their efforts. Reconstruction was not evenly distributed. Decisions had to be made about which areas received priority. Industrial centers critical to recovery often came first. Yet residential repair followed closely, reflecting an understanding that factories without workers, and workers without homes, could not sustain recovery. Children again became an implicit measure of success. Areas where schools reopened and families returned indoors showed measurable improvements in health and stability. Military government assessments noted reduced illness, improved order, and declining dependence on emergency aid. These outcomes reinforced the belief that rebuilding homes was not secondary to security, it was integral to it. Finally, there is a broader moral angle that extends beyond immediate occupation. The choice to rebuild rather than solely punish carried long-term implications. It suggested a vision of victory that extended beyond battlefield success. It acknowledged that power carried responsibility, even toward former enemies. For the children who watched walls rise where ruins once stood, these choices were not framed in ideology. They were experienced as tangible change. A dry place to sleep, a classroom that reopened, a street that no longer felt dangerous. These moments did not erase the trauma of war, but they marked a turning point, one where destruction gave way, gradually and unevenly, to reconstruction. That turning point would soon crystallize into decisive actions, where policy, logistics, and moral judgment converged under the pressure of time and necessity. By late 1945, the limits of improvisation had been reached. Emergency repairs and ad hoc solutions were no longer sufficient to meet the scale of devastation confronting the American occupation authorities. Winter approached with urgency. Weather reports warned of severe cold. Fuel shortages persisted. In many regions, children were still sleeping in unheated cellars and partially collapsed structures. The consequences of inaction were no longer hypothetical. It was during this period that reconstruction shifted from a reactive necessity to a defined operational priority. Within the U.S. zone, military government directives expanded the scope of housing repair programs. Engineer units were authorized to dedicate more manpower to civilian projects. Rubble clearance operations were intensified, employing thousands of German civilians under supervision. These efforts were not framed as generosity. Official language emphasized stabilization, public health, and security. Yet the effect on daily life was unmistakable. Specific cities illustrate this turning point clearly. In Cologne, where over 90% of the city center had been damaged, American authorities prioritized restoring habitable zones along transport corridors. In Frankfurt, bridge repairs enabled the movement of building materials and coal, accelerating residential reconstruction. In smaller towns across Bavaria and Hesse, military engineers reinforced surviving structures to prevent further collapse during winter storms. Children were again central to how urgency was measured. Medical officers reported rising cases of respiratory illness among minors living in exposed conditions. School administrators warned that education could not resume without safe buildings. These reports moved quickly through the occupation chain of command. Housing was no longer a secondary concern. It became a benchmark of control and legitimacy. American soldiers on the ground witnessed the consequences directly. Patrols passed families attempting to seal shattered windows with fabric and cardboard. Children scavenged wood from ruins for heating. These scenes were documented in after-action reports and photographic records, reinforcing the need for decisive intervention. The turning point also reflected a shift in American perception of time. Early occupation planning assumed a prolonged period of hardship before recovery could begin. Reality forced a reassessment. Each month of delay deepened social damage that would take years to undo. The longer children remained without stable shelter, the greater the long-term cost, not just to Germany, but to European stability as a whole. Reconstruction efforts therefore became more coordinated. Military government offices worked with local German administrators, vetted for non-Nazi affiliation, to identify priority housing blocks. Engineering units standardized repair methods to accelerate output. Temporary housing solutions, including prefabricated elements and repurposed structures, were expanded. This moment did not represent a single decision or declaration. It emerged from cumulative pressure, environmental, humanitarian, and strategic. The realization was clear. Victory had created obligations that could not be deferred. For German children observing these changes, the transformation was gradual but visible. Streets that had remained impassable for months were cleared. Buildings once written off as uninhabitable were stabilized. Entire neighborhoods shifted from survival mode toward cautious rebuilding. The American presence, once associated solely with defeat, now carried a different weight. Authority remained firm. Rules were enforced. But alongside them came tangible signs of continuity, proof that the future might contain something other than scarcity. This convergence of necessity, policy, and execution marked the true turning point of the occupation. Reconstruction was no longer an incidental outcome of stability efforts. It had become a deliberate strategy, one that would soon accelerate and expand under mounting international and domestic pressure. And as winter tightened its grip, the decisions made in these months would determine whether recovery could outpace despair. The winter of 1945 to 1946 tested the occupation's resolve. Temperatures across Central Europe fell sharply, and fuel shortages reached critical levels. Coal production lagged behind demand, transport networks remained fragile, and millions of civilians faced the cold with inadequate shelter. For children, the risks were immediate. Exposure, malnutrition, and illness converged into a silent crisis that statistics only partially captured. American authorities responded by accelerating reconstruction efforts beyond previous limits. Emergency winterization programs were expanded, focusing on sealing damaged buildings, restoring heating systems where possible, and redistributing housing to reduce overcrowding. In some areas, entire families were relocated from destroyed urban centers to less damaged rural communities. These moves were disruptive, but they reduced mortality during the coldest months. U.S. Army engineers worked continuously, often alongside German civilian laborers, to stabilize structures before they collapsed under snow and ice. Photographic evidence from the period shows soldiers reinforcing roofs, clearing debris, and repairing water systems in freezing conditions. These were not symbolic actions. They were calculated responses to measurable threats. The turning point became undeniable as results emerged. Reports from medical units in early 1946 noted a decline in weather-related child illnesses in districts where housing repairs had been completed. School attendance, though limited, increased where buildings were made usable again. The correlation was clear. Shelter meant survival. At the same time, American policy began to adapt formally to these realities. While long-term economic recovery programs were still under debate, occupation directives increasingly emphasized rehabilitation over restriction. The language of reports shifted. References to punishment and control gave way to terms such as restoration, normalization, and self-administration. This evolution did not occur in isolation. The broader geopolitical environment was changing rapidly. Tensions between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union were rising. A stable, functioning Germany in the Western zones became strategically valuable. Reconstruction, including housing, took on significance beyond immediate humanitarian need. It became a pillar of post-war alignment. For children living through this period, the political implications were invisible. What they saw were physical changes. Doors that closed properly. Floors that no longer flooded. Classrooms that reopened, even if only partially heated. These details defined their experience of peace more than any treaty or conference. The American presence also changed in subtle ways. Soldiers became administrators, engineers, and inspectors. Uniforms remained, but the nature of interaction evolved. Reconstruction sites required cooperation. Orders were given, but they were aimed at building rather than destruction. Trust remained fragile, yet it grew incrementally through repetition and consistency. By early 1946, the direction of occupation was no longer in doubt. Reconstruction had proven its necessity and effectiveness. The question was no longer whether to rebuild, but how far and how fast. Children, once symbols of vulnerability, became indicators of progress. Their improved health, shelter, and education signaled that recovery, however incomplete, was underway. This turning point did not erase the scars of war. Cities remained damaged. Families remained divided. Loss remained permanent. But the trajectory had shifted. The ruins were no longer static reminders of defeat. They were active sites of transformation. As winter gave way to spring, the focus moved from survival to consequence, from immediate repair to the lasting impact of these decisions. The true measure of reconstruction would soon be revealed not in buildings alone, but in how German society responded to the possibility of stability. By the spring of 1946, the immediate crisis had eased, but the consequences of the occupation's choices were becoming increasingly visible. Reconstruction had not solved Germany's problems, yet it had altered their trajectory. In the American zone, housing repairs, though partial, had restored basic shelter to millions of civilians. This shift carried measurable effects across health, order, and morale, particularly among children. Military government reports documented declining mortality rates among minors in districts where emergency housing programs had been implemented. Respiratory illnesses, which had surged during the winter, fell as insulation and heating improved. Overcrowding decreased in neighborhoods where damaged buildings were stabilized and reopened. These outcomes reinforced the strategic logic behind reconstruction. Stability reduced risk. Education followed closely behind housing. Schools could not function without safe structures, and occupation authorities recognized that prolonged disruption would produce long-term social damage. By mid-1946, thousands of classrooms across the U.S. zone were operating again, often in repaired or repurposed buildings. Attendance remained inconsistent due to food shortages and transportation challenges, but the return of structured learning marked a psychological turning point. For German children, this period represented the first sustained experience of normality since the early years of the war. Routine, even in limited form, provided a sense of continuity. Classrooms, heated rooms, and repaired streets offered tangible proof that life was no longer suspended in emergency mode. Public perception of the American presence also evolved during this phase. Initial fear and resentment did not disappear, but they were tempered by observation. Reconstruction was visible and persistent. Unlike propaganda, it could not be easily dismissed. Civilians judged occupation not by declarations but by outcomes, whether homes were livable, whether children survived winter, whether daily life stabilized. The American approach to reconstruction remained controlled and conditional. Assistance was tied to compliance with occupation regulations. German administrative participation was supervised. Yet this structure allowed for gradual re-engagement of local institutions. Municipal governments, once paralyzed, resumed limited functions under oversight. This cooperation increased efficiency and reduced friction. Children again served as a silent metric. Health assessments, school enrollment, and family reunification were tracked closely. Where conditions improved, cooperation increased. Where shortages persisted, tension remained. These patterns informed subsequent policy adjustments. At the same time, the limits of early reconstruction were evident. Housing shortages remained severe. Many families continued to live in damaged or overcrowded conditions. Rural areas absorbed refugees faster than resources allowed. The recovery was uneven and fragile. Nevertheless, the direction was unmistakable. The occupation had moved beyond containment. It had entered a phase where rebuilding civilian life was recognized as essential to long-term stability. This recognition extended beyond Germany's borders. Observers across Europe watched closely. The treatment of defeated Germany would shape post-war order, influence future alliances, and define the moral character of victory. As the practical outcomes of reconstruction became clearer, attention began to shift toward its broader implications, not only for German society, but for the evolving strategy of the United States in Europe. As 1946 progressed, the cumulative impact of reconstruction within the American zone became increasingly difficult to separate from larger political and strategic developments. Housing repair, initially conceived as an emergency response, now intersected with broader plans for economic recovery and regional stability. The condition of German children, healthier, housed, and returning to school, offered tangible evidence that controlled rebuilding was producing results. This period saw the gradual institutionalization of reconstruction efforts. What had begun as military necessity evolved into coordinated civil administration. American military government authorities expanded collaboration with German municipal officials, carefully selected and supervised. Responsibility for housing allocation, maintenance, and local infrastructure increasingly shifted to civilian hands, though oversight remained firm. International relief organizations also played a growing role. Agencies such as the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration provided supplemental food, clothing, and medical supplies. These resources supported children and families in communities where housing repairs had made permanent residence possible again. Reconstruction and relief reinforced each other, accelerating stabilization. Public attitudes toward the occupation continued to evolve. Hostility did not vanish, but it coexisted with acknowledgement. Surveys and reports from the period indicate a gradual decline in fear and an increase in cautious cooperation, particularly in areas where rebuilding was most visible. For children, this translated into fewer disruptions, safer environments, and the restoration of basic social structures. The psychological effect of rebuilding should not be underestimated. Homes are more than physical structures. They represent security, memory, and identity. For children who had known only displacement and ruin, returning to a repaired home, even a modest one, marked a profound shift. It anchored their experience of the post-war world in something stable and personal. By late 1946, American policymakers increasingly viewed Reconstruction as an investment rather than a concession. The emerging tensions of the early Cold War underscored the importance of a stable Western Europe. A Germany capable of supporting its population reduced the risk of unrest, extremism, and external influence. This thinking would soon inform more expansive recovery initiatives. Although the Marshall Plan lay ahead, its foundations were visible in these earlier housing and stabilization efforts. The lesson had been learned incrementally. Rebuilding civilian life was not separate from security, it was essential to it. For German children, the consequences of these decisions would extend far beyond the occupation years. The rebuilt neighborhoods, reopened schools, and restored routines shaped their formative experiences. Many would grow up associating the end of war not solely with defeat, but with the slow, disciplined process of reconstruction. This association mattered. It influenced how a new generation understood authority, responsibility, and international power. Victory, as they experienced it, was not expressed only through force, but through obligation. As time passed, the immediacy of rubble and repair would fade into memory. But the significance of those early decisions, made under pressure, scarcity, and uncertainty, would remain embedded in the post-war order. With the physical aftermath examined, what remains is to reflect on what this episode reveals about warfare, victory, and the human cost that follows when fighting ends. The rebuilding of German homes after 1945 did not erase the causes or consequences of the war that had preceded it. It did not absolve responsibility, nor did it undo the destruction that had been inflicted across Europe. What it did, however, redefine the meaning of victory in the modern age. For German children, the end of the war was not marked by surrender documents or parades. It was marked by whether a roof could withstand winter, whether a classroom reopened, whether life could resume without constant fear of collapse. In these small, tangible outcomes, the abstract idea of peace became real. The American decision to help rebuild civilian life emerged from necessity as much as principle. Stability required shelter, security required health, and long-term peace required more than control, it required continuity. In recognizing this, occupation authorities acted not as conquerors alone, but as stewards of a fragile transition. This episode reveals a broader truth about warfare. Destruction may decide battles, but reconstruction determines what follows. The power to defeat carries with it the power to shape recovery. How that power is used leaves a deeper imprint than the fighting itself. The rebuilt homes of post-war Germany were imperfect, provisional, and often modest. Yet they represented a choice to prevent further collapse, to reduce suffering, and to allow a generation shaped by war to grow within something resembling normality. For children who had known only air raids and displacement, this choice mattered profoundly. History often measures wars by their weapons, strategies, and leaders. But the legacy of conflict is just as clearly written in how societies care for the most vulnerable when the fighting ends. In Germany, The sight of former enemies helping to rebuild what had been destroyed became one of the earliest signs that war's final chapter had begun. Not with celebration, but with responsibility.